Astrology, Science or Art. From Ciro Discepolo's book Nuova Guida all'Astrologia, published by Armenia, astrology has existed for over 5,000 years and is the oldest science in the world. Science or art? Opinions are divided, and to allow even the reader approaching this universe for the first time to form a generally objective assessment of this dispute, a brief history of astrology has been summarized below, including an overview of its fields of application, the categories into which it is divided, the main accusations it receives, and the responses it offers. Astrology can be defined as the component of human thought that studies the relationship between the spatial position of celestial bodies in our solar system and the corresponding manifestations on Earth that are significantly linked to it. The earliest records of astrology date back to the time of the 4th dynasty of Egypt, approximately 2800 BC. There is reliable evidence that already at that time King Sargon of Akkadu employed priests. These were the first astrologers to make predictions. In this regard, it should be remembered that initially astrology was used only for predictions concerning the king. Many centuries had to pass before it became a popular science, in the sense that horoscopes were also cast for ordinary people. Over the centuries, techniques were refined, and it benefited from all the new discoveries in knowledge, as well as the direct contributions of some of the greatest thinkers of the ancient world. Originally, every astrologer was also an astronomer and was able to calculate all the positional data needed to cast a horoscope. Ptolemy, Plotinus, St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, Bacon, Tommaso Campanella, Copernicus, Kepler, Goethe, and Carl Gustav Jung are just a few of the many great names who, over the centuries, have seriously studied astrology. Here are some of their thoughts. Aristotle: this world is necessarily connected to the movements of the higher world. Every power in our world is governed by these movements. St. Thomas Aquinas: the celestial bodies are the cause of what happens in this sublunary world. They influence human actions indirectly, but not all the effects they produce are inevitable. Kepler: 20 years of practical study have convinced my rebellious spirit of the reality of astrology. Goethe: I was born in Frankfurt am Main on August 28, 1749, at the stroke of 12. The constellation was favorable. The sun was in the sign of Virgo. Jupiter and Venus were in good aspect with the sun. Mercury was not unfavorable. Saturn and Mars neutral. Only the full moon that day exerted its reverberating force, all the more powerful because its planetary hour had begun. It therefore opposed my birth until this hour had passed. These favorable aspects, much appreciated by astrologers later, were undoubtedly the reason why I remained alive. In fact, due to the ineptitude of the midwife, they thought I had died upon coming into the world, and it was only after numerous efforts that I saw the light. Carl Gustav Jung: if people whose education leaves much to be desired have until now believed they could mock astrology, considering it a pseudoscience long since dismissed, this astrology which rises from the depths of the popular soul appears today once again at the doors of our universities, which it left 3 centuries ago. And again the same. Each of us was born at a specific moment in a specific place, and like a vintage wine possesses the qualities of the year and season in which we were born. This is what astrology affirms. The popularity of astrology has undergone ups and downs over the centuries, and astrologers have had moments of glory and persecution, depending on various factors, including, not least, the personal opinion that the prince, monarch, or pope of the moment had on the subject. There were astrologers burned alive by the ecclesiastical inquisition, and popes like Sixtus IV practiced and protected astrology. In Bologna from 1125 until the 18th century, a chair of astrology was held at the university, and that was perhaps the most brilliant period for this fascinating subject. Subsequently, with the Enlightenment, interest declined, due to the spirit of that historical moment that had discovered the power of science and used it to banish the ghosts of medieval superstition. Unfortunately, in the great witch hunt that followed, no one thought to distinguish between good and bad, and many things were lumped together. Thus, a vast cultural heritage was at risk of being lost, and it was only thanks to the isolated efforts of various scholars that astrology was not definitively banned. The pseudoscientists of the time attempted to destroy it, but they failed because astrology, unlike other so-called esoteric sciences that are wrongly compared to it, has a real, authentic, and verifiable basis. This is demonstrated by the fact that with the advent of psychology, it regained relevance, and with the help of this new science, was able to express its full archetypal and universal content. In the first half of the current century, there was a real boom in interest in it, especially in Germany, where the astrologer Reinhold Ebertin founded the Academy of Cosmobiology, introducing new methods of analysis. Regarding Germany, it is interesting to recall a historical moment regarding the subject in question, which occurred during the Second World War. British counterintelligence used the astrologer De Hole to predict Hitler's moves. According to the Allies, he was taking advice from a group of astrologers. In reality, this wasn't exactly the case, as Ehrlich Howe explained in his book, The Astrologers of Nazism, published by Mondadori. Hitler consulted several astrologers, but only shortly before his death, and according to them he expected the stars to bend to his will. In the early years of his dictatorship, there was a very famous astrologer in Germany, Kraft, the author of various statistical works, some of whose data were later revealed to be false. This astrologer predicted the exact day of the assassination attempt that was about to cost the Führer his life several months in advance, and sent a letter to the SS command to warn them. When the assassination attempt actually occurred, the German secret police no longer remembered Kraft's message, and he had the terrible idea of publicly boasting about the prediction. He was then arrested as a suspected accomplice to the attackers and deported to a concentration camp along with all German astrologers, where he died of illness a few years later. In 1970, Neptune entered the sign of Sagittarius, and as many had predicted, there was a resurgence of interest in astrology, an interest that has now taken on inflationary overtones. The current situation can be amply clarified by some statistics conducted in France several years ago, but these have not changed much today, authors note, by Iris Marketing and the IFOP, French Institute of Public Opinion. These statistics show that 60% of French people read their horoscopes, and 58% are interested in astrology. The same data shows that those most interested in the topic are young people between the ages of 18 and 25, and by social class, these are white-collar workers, 68%, followed closely by industrialists and company directors, followed by blue-collar workers with 63%, and finally farmers with 44%. To these results while of limited value as statistical products, are nonetheless interesting, especially because they indicate that, contrary to popular belief, it is not the less educated who are interested in astrology, but rather the opposite. In France, interest in this discipline is very strong, with thousands of professionals at all levels. The same is true in England, where there are actual universities offering courses exclusively in astrology. In Germany, the Netherlands, Spain, the United States, South America, and many other countries, there is still a strong popular interest in astrology, not to mention many countries in the Far East, where the vast majority of the population takes no significant action without first consulting an astrologer. For the general public, astrology continues to be that of horoscopes in glossy magazines and the practice of various magicians, sorcerers, witches, and pseudo-healers. Not everyone knows that there also exists, and above all, a serious, erudite astrology with a cultural background spanning thousands of years. Many scholars from diverse backgrounds devote themselves to this astrology. Currently, astrologers can be classified into two broad categories: scientistic astrologers and symbolists. The first group, identified in France as conditionalists, includes all those scholars who seek to inductively demonstrate the validity of what has been called the world's oldest science. To this end, they draw on the experiences of specialists in the fields of physics, chemistry, biology, etc. Here are some. American researcher Brown Jr. has demonstrated that there is a close parallel between the graph illustrating the lunar day and that relating to the oxygen absorption by potatoes, algae, carrots, etc. Two, a study on mice demonstrated that these animals, even when confined in a laboratory, reach peak activity levels in relation to certain lunar positions. 3. Similar experiments have been successfully conducted on various species of marine mollusks. 4. The French scientist Michel Gauquelin and later his wife Françoise studied thousands of horoscopes of scientists, athletes, politicians, and others, and found that the planets that, according to astrology, identify these professions were indeed significantly present at the time of the birth in the horoscopes drawn for the occasion, and far exceeded the index suggested by the calculation of probabilities for an equal number of randomly selected citizens. 5. In 1968, Dr. Eugen Jonas, a Czechoslovakian, was appointed director of a clinic near Prague for his studies on ovulation in women. Over approximately 10 years of trials, he experimented on thousands of women, determining the day of a second monthly ovulation, independent of the Ogino-Knaus cycle, and the sex of unborn children whose day of conception was known. For his investigations, Dr. Jonas simply monitored the position of the sun and moon at the time of the woman's birth. According to the Czechoslovakian researcher who visited us in our Naples office in the late 1980s, these experiments yielded results with a degree of accuracy greater than 98% of the cases examined. 6. Dr. Schultz, Soviet, and Takata, Japanese, demonstrated the link between solar explosions, the so-called spots, and certain recurrence of heart attacks that occur in men simultaneously with these astrophysical phenomena. 7. The Italian physicist Picardi demonstrated the action of cosmic waves on liquids. It's worth remembering that the human body is mostly made of water. 8. The American engineer J.H. Nelson of RCA uses the study of planetary positions to predict radio disturbances that disrupt telecommunications. And the list could go on for many pages. Symbolist astrologers, on the other hand, are psychologically oriented. They do not believe it's possible to make astrology an exact science because they believe the various symbols that appear in it cannot be quantified or catalogued, while not denying the validity of the scientific results obtained so far, and while not declaring themselves against a view of astrology based on the principle of cause and effect. They prefer to classify it among the phenomena of synchronicity. For those unfamiliar with this Jungian concept, it's worth remembering that according to C.G. Jung, found in nature, in addition to the law of causality, the law of synchronicity, which can be defined as the simultaneous occurrence of two or more events, linked by the same analogical meaning and independent of the cause that produced them. Starting from this concept, symbolist astrologers affirm, for example, that during the month of January, when the temperature is very low, nature is almost dead, water freezes, etc., the sun is in Capricorn, and Capricorns are born on Earth, beings who are essentially cold, rational, unexciting, and unsentimental. Conversely, in August, nature is at its most powerful, the sun. Throughout this volume, the reader will find sun written in relation to astronomical references and sun, in the case of astrological references, edi, burns relentlessly, and nature is marked by the principle of power, grandeur, and expansion. Leos are born during this period, and they have a predisposition for leadership and a strong, confident, and winning temperament. And so on for the other astrological signs and symbols interpreted analogically. One of the tools most used by scientists to assert their ideas is statistics. Symbolists or conditionalists contest the use of this method, and Barbault explains why. Unlike the statistical method, which reveals the overall properties of a group and only concerns the particular through the index of a generality of cases, the analogical method begins with the unity, the cell, that original and irreducible factor that is man. It integrates the individual element, the specific factor, into its field of observation. It starts from the concrete, from existing individuals. Peter, Paul, John, 11. This method of comparison consists in bringing together individuals with a common configuration and in attempting to discover the analogous or common factors or elements of life corresponding to this configuration. It involves extracting from all the characters who present the same astral phenomenon the manifestation, albeit differently expressed, of the same group of psychological tendencies. Beyond internal disputes, which are no small matter, astrologers must fight their battles, as one might expect, primarily against old and new enemies who seek, for various reasons, to deny the validity of astrology. The criticism they are called upon to defend themselves against almost daily is the now hackneyed one regarding the pseudo-shift of the zodiac signs due to the phenomenon known as the precession of the equinoxes. It's fair to say that if one day the enemies of astrology were to join together and establish preparatory courses for the fight, they would certainly devote maximum emphasis to this point, which in their view is of primary importance, yet ends up being completely inconsistent. The phenomenon known as the precession of the equinoxes is due to the spinning top effect, in which the Earth's polar axis describes a cone, much like a spinning top that is winding down. This causes the sun to no longer face the same degree of the sidereal zodiac at the spring equinox each year. This shift is equal to 30 degrees every 260 years or so. The shift is retrograde with respect to the signs and goes in the direction of Aries, Pisces, Aquarius, Capricorn, Sagittarius, Scorpio, Libra, Virgo, Leo, Cancer, Gemini, and Taurus. When astrology began to take shape in the 2 millennia before the birth of Christ, the constellation of Aries was in the direction of the Sun at the spring equinox. Today, the gamma point, 0 degrees Aries of the ecliptic, is located between the 1st degree of Pisces and the 30th of Aquarius. It was the Greek astronomer Hipparchus who described the phenomenon in the last century BC. Subsequently, astrologers believed they should look for the reference to the above, not in the fixed constellations, but in those zones of space between the Earth and them, which host the Sun at various times of the year. These zones, the signs of the zodiac, were subdivided 30 degrees at a time and continued to bear the names of the constellations, to which they were dedicated only symbolically. Astrologers have therefore been aware of this reality for thousands of years, and have never confused the tropical zodiac with the sidereal zodiac, i.e., between signs and constellations. Opponents may disagree on the validity of the tropical zodiac, but they cannot accuse astrologers of being either the subject or the object of confusion in this regard. Some might and do object that the supposedly unique values that astrologers claim objectify one sign over another need to be proven, and this leads to another major criticism. Astrology is not an exact science. And indeed, it isn't. But is this a fault? Can we perhaps say that medicine is an exact science? Isn't it true that there can be as many conflicting opinions when faced with an X-ray as there are doctors? And on the other hand, why not hold the same fault against psychology, which, for example, could be asked following this logic to demonstrate on a microscope slide the objectivity of an Oedipus or Cain complex? Is 16. Probably the only serious criticism that can be leveled at the discipline that deals with the stars is that it hasn't sufficiently updated its symbols, that it still relies on too much outdated material. This is partly true and is mainly due to the fact that since astrology left the universities until today, it has been practiced predominantly by impostors and uncultured men. Currently, however, there is a real collective support among many members of the global intelligentsia for its cultural roots, and this is the qualifying element that is reproposing it in a completely new guise to the world. In the face of the atavistic hostility that a section of the power has always directed toward astrology, astrologers present the fruits of their labor and suggest tests that can enlighten skeptics. Here are some very significant ones, conducted in 1961 in the United States by psychologist Vernon Clark and published in the book The Enigma of the Zodiac by Jacques Sadoul, Palazzi ed. The researcher enlisted the help of 23 astrologers of different nationalities, who did not know which of their colleagues were participating in the test. Clark also assembled a group of scientists to verify the results. Here is what Sadoul says in the book cited. Test number 1 concerns the verification of the alleged ability of astrologers to be able to indicate the future qualities of a person starting from the date of birth. 20 astrologers were presented with 10 birth dates, divided into 2 groups, 5 men and 5 women, corresponding to 10 people who practice the following professions: musician, art educator, prostitute, herpetologist, bookseller, doll maker, veterinarian, drama teacher, librarian, and artist. The horoscopes were to serve as the basis for the tests and naturally had to be chosen at random, but all individuals met a twofold essential condition. They had to have practiced their profession for a considerable period of time and this profession had to constitute their primary occupation. Vernon Clark selected subjects between the ages of 45 and 65, born in the United States, whose birth time was known as precisely as possible. A control group of 20 psychologists was formed who took the tests using the same data as the astrologers, namely, the list of professions and birth dates. The results they reached followed the law of chance. In contrast, the astrologers obtained a probability of 100 to 1. It should be noted that 2 of the horoscopes chosen belonged to people born on the same day of the same year, 5 hours apart, the prostitute and the librarian. Commenting on the results, Vernon Clark said, "From this test, it was possible to conclude that human characteristics are influenced or determined by the position of the planets at birth, and that astrologers, starting solely from birth data, can identify and divine certain characteristics." Test number 2 is as follows. 10 pairs of horoscopes were presented to 20 astrologers. Each pair included the subject's detailed life history and, in particular, the precise dates of a certain number of important events: marriage, accident, major journey, death. They were warned that one of the 2 horoscopes corresponded to the story of this life, while the other belonged to a person of the same sex, more or less the same age and the same place, but who had had a completely different life. In reality, the false horoscope did not correspond to a real person, but had simply been cast at random, starting from a birth date 1 year different from that of the real person. Vernon Clark commented on the results as follows. They are such that there is a 1 in 1,000 probability that they could be due to chance. 3 astrologers were 100% successful, 15 significantly exceeded the line of chance, 2 astrologers remained at the level of chance, none below. For the third test, 30 astrologers were given 10 pairs of horoscopes, one of which belonged to a person affected by cerebral palsy at birth, while the other was that of a person of superior intelligence who had not been affected by any serious illness except childhood ones. The birth dates of the 2 groups were provided by several doctors and psychologists in contact with each other who had verified them in civil registry records. The 10 people chosen were chosen at random from all the cases proposed by the doctors and psychologists. Their birth data were then sent to an astrologer who had not participated in the previous tests and who was renowned for his precision in drawing up astrological charts. He was commissioned to draw the 20 natal charts without informing him of the purpose of this operation, and of course without requesting any interpretations. The charts he drew were photocopied and sent unchanged to the various astrologers participating in the experiment. This time no life histories were provided, but it was simply stated that in each case, one horoscope belonged to a person with cerebral palsy, while the other belonged to a healthy and highly intelligent individual. They were asked to identify the charts of the brain-ill patients. The probability that their results would be the result of chance was 1 in 100. 20 astrologers succeeded significantly above the law of chance, 10 at the level of chance or below. From these experiments, Clark concluded, the ability demonstrated by astrologers to distinguish between true and false birth dates is of extreme interest to the critics of astrology. Its opponents maintain, for example, that there is no relationship between the state of the heavens and human beings, which implies that one horoscope is just as valid as another, or not valid at all, for the purpose of providing information about one person or another. The fact that astrologers were able to distinguish false birth dates seems to demolish this skeptical position. These are examples of how astrology can be proven with experiments that take into account the very nature of the subject. But the best way to dispel any doubts on the subject remains direct study of its pronouncements and practical verification achieved day after day through the examination of as many horoscopes as possible. Astrology, unlike many divinatory arts that are wrongly compared to it as a mathematical objective basis, verifiable by anyone, the search for definitive proof of its credibility leaves both the detractor and the partisan who have searched in vain bitter. There is none, for the simple reason that every horoscope is different from another and contains within itself a unique universe that therefore cannot be found in handbooks, tables, and clichés that supposedly demonstrate the correlation between high and low. These millions of unique universes, individual horoscopes, can, however, be deciphered according to a basic framework based on the key tenets of astrology. Therefore, any person of common sense with some experience in the field and with average education, if motivated by good faith, can verify the value of this science. We will address the practical side of the subject later, but now, before attempting to answer the initial question, it will be useful to consider the areas of daily life in which astrology can be most useful to know oneself better. Today, more than ever, man needs external aid to understand himself, having lost the physiological connection he once had with the surrounding reality. The study of his own body's reactions, manifestations in relation to the universal outside world, is no longer among the activities practiced by man. Increasingly attentive to the superficial behavioral models suggested by the mass media, he ends up realizing only through neuroses that he does not know himself deeply and that he suffers for it. The most effective tools available today to help in this direction are psychoanalysis and astrology. The former, currently recognized by all as suitable for the purpose, has a negative aspect: the sometimes excessive duration of treatment. The latter offers a faster service, independent of both the patient's age and willingness to cooperate. However, to offer results as valid as those obtained through psychoanalysis, it must not be limited to a simple explanation of the horoscope, and above all, requires a high level of professionalism on the part of the astrologer, who should preferably have conducted his own in-depth analysis to avoid projections onto the patient. Pedagogical support and guidance in the career direction of young people. This is the area where astrology is best applied. A woman once asked Freud what the best method was for raising children, and the psychologist responded negatively, stating that whatever the method, the results are always poor. It's possible to at least partially contradict Freud, given that knowing, for example, that a Leo child shouldn't be humiliated in the presence of others certainly yields a better result than acting in ignorance. By consulting an astrologer, one can identify the salient point of the child's problem and attempt, where possible, to act according to an appropriate therapeutic plan that the astrologer can recommend. The choice of hobbies and educational path for children truly represents the key to the application of astrology. Aren't many of the so-called child prodigies adolescents who were fortunate enough to practice from a very young age? What exactly corresponded to their talent? An astrologer can advise parents on the sports, artistic, and educational activities best suited to the child and prevent the child from being forced perhaps to play the piano, which he or she is not good at, but which represents the unfulfilled dream of the parent who, as an adult and through his or her child, tries to fulfill. Much of the anxiety of work could be avoided if each young person were guided at the right time to choose not what they seem to like at the moment, but rather what comes closest to their deepest desires and talents, which at this point may be silent. Searching for a destined partner. If we overcome the obstacle of romanticism and accept the principle that marriage or an equivalent relationship is not only the natural conclusion of a complex of feelings, but also and above all represents the mature choice of two adults who decide, after rationally weighing the pros and cons, to join their destinies for an indefinite period, then astrology can have its say. It seems more appropriate to face a reality and also to know how to say no to one's feelings, rather than bask in the sweet oblivion of love and imitate ostriches that bury their heads in the ground, only to discover sometimes the bitterness of a reality that, however reversible, can never restore things to their original state. Astrology can assess the marriageability quotient between two people and advise against it, with the utmost clarity in cases where there is no guarantee of long-term stability. The same applies to choosing business partners, study partners, etc. Recently, according to reports from England, horoscopes have been used to match organ donors with future recipients, achieving excellent results. Recruitment. Some large American companies already do this. Even in Italy, mostly small businesses turn to the expert for advice on hiring. The most ethical approach in this case would be, for example, to assign 100 aspiring workers to the 100 most suitable positions. This would maximize the company's profitability and provide the best working conditions for the recruits. Often, however, the stars are used for secret police purposes to determine whether an aspiring worker is inherently subversive, dishonest, lazy, etc. Health astrology can determine an individual's pathological predispositions from birth. Knowing this, it is possible to implement various forms of preventative hygiene in nutrition, corrective exercise, choice of supportive therapies, career guidance, etc., capable of weakening, if not eliminating, ailments as they arise. Astrology is more fallible when it comes to uncovering the origin of a mysterious ailment whose diagnosis is difficult even for medicine. Not all astrologers agree on this point, but we must be honest enough to acknowledge the limitations of stargazing, especially since acknowledging its limitations does not diminish its value, but rather presents it in a more realistic, positive, and credible light. Analysis of world problems and related predictions. This is the most fallible area of astrology's application. This is due not to the science's imperfection, but rather to its limited human decipherability, as well as to the sheer number of variables that come into play when analyzing a complex reality such as a country's economy or its evolving political direction. To make valid statements about a nation's destiny, it is necessary to evaluate and decipher, taking into account the interrelationships, the horoscopes of the states with which it maintains political and economic relations, as well as those of its leaders, opposition parties, and everything else, both domestically and internationally, that matters in shaping the nation's fortunes, not to mention the problem of choosing the birth date of a company or nation, which is necessary for casting a horoscope. For example, not everyone agrees on that of Italy. Should we consider the unification of the Risorgimento, the promulgation of the Republic, or the enactment of the Constitution. 1,000 small daily problems one day. If astrology gains the favor and official recognition of those in power, as well as popular support, anyone will be able to use it, probably by calling a 2-digit number, as is done today for weather information, time, road conditions, etc., and thus optimize the economy of their energies. One can then avoid going to look for a book on the day the moon squares one's Mars in the 3rd house. Leave for vacation with a beautiful Jupiter entering the 9th house. Schedule an important appointment on the most appropriate day. Go to the dentist when the moon is neither in Capricorn nor Taurus. Avoid showing off your diving skills to friends when Mars is threatening your skies, and so on for 1,000 other easy applications. Sure, you might say all this will make life terribly boring once the unexpected has passed, but there are so many unknowns that not even astrology can illuminate them all, and then there's always the possibility, for those who wish, of flipping the switch and being left without astrology. At this point, it's possible to answer the initial question. Is astrology a science or an art? Given that the answer, like the question, can only satisfy the critic who intends to label it, and not the astrologer who practices it, it's possible to respond that it is both a science and an art. A science like psychology and other similar disciplines, in that its authenticity can be verified through the inductive study method, using the statistical method as a partial verification. An art because, lacking a sufficient number of codified objective data expressing all the physical, biological, psychological, and other variables that characterize humanity, it requires human input to fill this gap with the subjective and therefore variable to a greater or lesser extent ability to discover all the analogies that can be traced back to the same symbol, the key to all astrological discourse.